honeys, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about a fun little feature of history, something called the World Fairs, or sometimes also Columbian Expositions. Though a few have been referenced here and there in various popular culture, Loki and other time-traveling endeavors. But we, of course, as art historians, have our own approach to this topic. So today, honeys, not only will we cover the general history of these events, the whats and the whys, the whens, the wheres, we're going to zoom in on the artwork found within one of these fairs, and more specifically, within one building of one of these fairs, to tell a relatively untold, or at least far less popularly known story about some of the women involved in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Our sources for today include the National Park Service, the libraries of the University of Maryland, UPenn's libraries, Time Magazine, architecture.org, more National Park Service sites, the New York Times, the Smithsonian Magazine, and others. And so, honeys, here we go. So, the World's Fairs, the Columbian Expositions. What, why, when, where, how? The Smithsonian requotes Robert W. Rydell, a cultural historian and the author of the book All the World's a Fair, when he says, quote, "World's fairs are generally part of a reaction to social dislocation, political upheaval, and deep anxiety about the future," end quote, in reference to space race elements of the 1961 Seattle Exposition. He also writes, quote, "When they first began back in the middle of the 19th century, they were overwhelmingly perceived by both organizers and visitors almost as world's universities," end quote. But that times and mostly political motivations have changed. Essentially, what these fairs were large international exhibitions featuring ranges of industrial, scientific, and cultural items on display at a specific site for a set period, typically 3 to 6 months. Usually these fairs would include, especially if they were a World's Fair, of course, exhibitions from a significant number of countries, as well as an entertainment zone. As of 1928, a Paris-based organization, the Bureau International des Expositions, or BIE, handles all the scheduling, the rights and responsibilities. Over 100 such fairs and expositions have occurred in over 20 countries worldwide since the mid-1800s. They've generally been split into 3 eras. The first, industrialization, was about 1851 to 1938. The second, cultural exchange, was about 1939 to 1987. And then you have nation branding, 1988 to the present. But where did the idea for a show like this even come from? The origins of this format is found in English national fairs of the 1700s, which were combinations of trade shows and public entertainment. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, their rivals across the Channel, the French, began hosting national, specifically industrial exhibition, which the British then copied the format of, and then in 1851, Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, did an international one of these industrial exhibitions in Great Britain. Albert calls this the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. A very subtle title, and the success of that one, especially its housing structure, the Crystal Palace, kicked off the rest of the fairs as visitors returned home and drummed up excitement to participate in or host their nation's own fairs/exhibitions. So by the 1870s, this international exposition format has become a movement catching the attention of the planners behind the centennial commemoration of the U.S.'s Declaration of Independence. They decided that a World's Fair would be the most appropriate type of celebration, leading to the U.S. Centennial Exhibition held in Philly in 1876. Although that exposition ended up being a large financial loss, it was redeemed in some ways by its critical success and the attendance of just under 10 million to it. The Centennial also inspired a World's Fair boom in the U.S., especially the South, for the next 40 years. There are some characteristic differences between the U.S.'s quote-unquote golden era of World's Fairs and Europe's fairs at the time. U.S. participation in European expositions was privately managed even for expositions held within the U.S. Federal aid was confined to U.S. government pavilions and exhibits. European fairs, however, say our sources, were much more government enterprises. Our sources also note American fairs were much quicker to include entertainment venues in the form of rides, exotic attractions, and sadly by the 1890s, the so-called foreign or native villages as well. In the United States context, the World's Fairs passed into the past and fond memories alone after World War I, especially as the Cold War set in, many fewer were held and they were much less successful. And now let's talk about the 1893 exposition in more general terms. Britannica says it's arguably the most significant World's Fair in U.S. history and one of the most important in the history of world expositions. The University of Maryland agrees it was notable for its impressive architecture and large international audience. The timing of the event was very specific. It commemorated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's landfall in the Americas, hence its sometimes title of the Columbus Expo. It ran May through October of 1893. And why Chicago, you may be asking? Partially because of Chicago's extensive railway system, its central location, and also its citizens' fundraising efforts, said Congress. Chicagoans raised more than $5 million in 1893 money. But, says architecture.org, quote, there was another factor at play, Chicago's tenacity. While New York boasted its logistical capabilities, Chicago touted its resilience, having risen literally from its own ashes, end quote. Chicago's attitude and advantages allowed it to beat out New York City, St. Louis, and D.C. to host the expo. And it brought people and ideas to Chicago from over 40 countries as well as all over the United States. The main focus of the exposition was to celebrate Western, quote-unquote, progress, including women's achievements. It included an area of the fairgrounds, unironically, nicknamed the White City, which showcased electrical discoveries and other modern achievements for the crowds. It's also fairly impressive that the World's Congress Auxiliary hosted over 100 congresses about scholarly and cultural topics in a new building in Grant Park. After the end of that exposition, the building became home to the Art Institute of Chicago. And now that you're a little familiar with the fair, let's talk about the women's building and their role in the 1893 exposition. To best understand the progress that was made with this 1893 edition, we're going to take one quick look back at the 1875 edition and some important differences there. Women had been designated their own section in the 1875 main fair building until a last-minute revocation of that decision. The women were suddenly told that any display of theirs would have to be in their own building and paid for by their own funding. Although the women were able to collect enough funds for construction to take place, the president of the Women's Executive Committee herself, Mrs. E.D. Gillespie, said that, quote, weary and longing for rest, we never thought of employing a woman architect, end quote. So the first entirely designated women's pavilion was erected in 1876 in Philly, but not by a woman artist or architect. In this way, the Chicago situation was a little more straightforward. Women were able to contribute to exhibits, they spoke at events, they served in leadership roles, and the building, their building, was mainly a place of learning in spite of some gender-based restrictions. We'll start, honeys, with the planning stage. Once the Chicago Fair bid was secured, a handful of civically engaged upper-class women started pressuring the exposition administrators for greater representation. So much so that Congress authorized and funded the exposition's Board of Lady Managers. That was a diverse group of 117 board members, 2 women members from each state and territory, as well as 9 from Chicago, with the rest being from participating international delegations. These 117 board members were historic as the first women to serve in any official capacity at a World's Fair. The international delegates, they represented every corner of the world: England, France, Spain, Germany, Austria, Italy, Holland, Portugal, Brazil, Cuba, Mexico, Ecuador, Venezuela, Algeria, Siam, Japan. And they all participated in the planning, especially the interior decoration. And yet, as fantastic as all that is, these invitations were extended just to upper-class or aristocratic women, so it was not entirely a representative sample. Things were not always perfect on the board. There was some tension within it regarding presidential elections, for example. Socialite Bertha Honoré Palmer beat out middle-aged suffragist Phoebe Couzens for the role. Yet Time magazine says, quote, Palmer ultimately won, not least because her politically minded detractors set about working toward an entirely separate task, collecting money for the erection of a statue of Queen Isabella elsewhere in the fair. In paying homage to the Spanish queen who funded Columbus's expedition rather than the man himself, they imagined themselves the true radicals, end quote. Yet maybe Palmer's win was still an okay thing, as she lobbied for a woman architect and was all-inclusive in some ways for white women. For example, she pushed for a childcare facility in a nearby building. We're going to break here for the tiniest architecture plug I ever did do. Her husband, Potter Palmer, had built the Palmer House Hotel as her wedding gift. It first burned down in less than 2 years later. The second stood, 1875 to the 1920s, and the third edition still stands in Chicago today. Notably, though, a lot of our sources say that the women were still excluded from a lot of major decision-making. Most of what they were allowed to do was decorative decisions, so the board was, at the end of the day, primarily a formality. As she wanted, though, Palmer got that woman architect, so the hard work begins in 1891, when the Exposition's construction department holds a design competition for the women's building. And it's not hard work because there's many rules. In fact, there's only one rule. The only women who can compete are those with formal architectural training. Seems pretty obvious. The thing about that one rule is that there were not many women with formal architectural training. This is still the 1890s after all, and it's not the most typical thing for a woman to have a career like that. The winner ends up being 21-year-old Sophia Hayden, who had to be talked into submitting a proposal. She was overqualified, arguably, as the first woman to earn a 4-year architecture degree from MIT. Hayden based her design on Italian Renaissance principles, so she created a grand columned entrance under a 45-foot-long pediment decorated by the sculptor Alice Rideout, and which depicted female personifications of so-called feminine virtues and pursuits, ones like charity, art, home life, as well as woman's place in history, or women as the spirit of civilization. That entrance then led to an open-feeling central hall with glass ceilings and open arcades with classical columns between the first and second floors. The plot for the women's pavilion was located just north of the horticulture building. Its eastern front entrance faced a man-made lagoon with a terrace extending to the tip of the waterline, so super picturesque. The building was on the smaller side, though. It only measured 388 by 199 feet and cost nearly $150,000 when it was done. The final product, though, was met with controversial reviews from architectural journals and the public, who thought it was too simple and unassertive compared to the male design buildings at the fair. Others derided it as too feminine and delicate. Hayden was under such intense scrutiny and pressure for the women's building that she suffered a quote-unquote brain fever during construction, which is now thought to likely be a nervous breakdown, and never practiced architecture again. The women's building was her first and last realized project. As sad as that is, what was so unique, so compelling about the women's building is that it exclusively featured women's accomplishments and was a physical site just for them. The building contained exhibition spaces, a large assembly room, a library housing 7,000 books by women, including 47 translations of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, as well as a model nursery and a hall of honor detailing accomplished women. As I've said, women produced all aspects of the building's design, ornamentation, and content. The interior decoration was largely overseen by Candace Wheeler. She commissioned artists like Mary Cassatt and her own daughter Dora Wheeler to include murals, and this was a big deal. Our sources say, quote, customarily, large-scale murals and sculptures were the domain of men, so it was newsworthy when the female managers of the women's building commissioned Mary Cassatt and Mary McMonnies to create monumental paintings for the building's grand hall, Alice Rideout to craft large-scale sculptures for the exterior of the building, end quote, and for many of these other female artists' decisions. In a large art exhibit court in the center of the building, 7 women muralists total had works displayed which displayed the progress cycle of women in their eyes. The women represented their female space without men. For example, Cassatt in Modern Woman shows women picking the fruits of knowledge. This was the most daring and most criticized, with sexist language and critique of her person, out of many of the murals. Yet it was an opportunity for Cassatt, who was the most experienced of the participating artists but had never done murals. Other women were plenty involved too. Among them was Mary McMonnies Lowe, who created the mural Primitive Woman. Her mural sat opposite the impressionistic one by Cassatt at the opposite end of the Gallery of Honor in the Women's Building, and it had a more traditional, more neoclassical style to it. It was considered more in line with the exterior design style of the building, whereas Cassatt's was kind of experimental, kind of unorthodox. Reports from the day tell us that McMonnies Lowe's mural depicts these idealized, primitive women, quote, engaged in the various industries and pursuits of her time. The scene is outdoors with a blue lake and its bordering trees for a background, end quote. Many viewers of the day also speculated that the central figure was meant to represent motherhood, with women on either side sowing seed and carrying jars of water as this reference to the cycle of life. Another mural, titled Women of Plymouth, was the only one to apparently survive into today by my research. It was created by the then 23-year-old Lucia Fuller and depicted 17 early American women doing such daily tasks like the spinning, the washing, educating children. Though most of the other murals had disappeared through some method or another, this one was found in a deteriorating building in Cornish, though it's unclear exactly when. It's partially this bizarre finding that has led to the rumor that the Women of Plymouth was never actually shown at the World Fair. Claims have circulated that the critics noticed there was an anachronistic error, that the tree lumps were shown sawn smooth rather than roughly axed by the pilgrims. But that's not true. We know because photos of the Gallery of Honor in the Women's Building show it up on the wall. When the exposition's superintendent of sculpture, Lorado Taft, asked Daniel Burnham, the director of works, if he could hire his best female students from the Art Institute School as assistants, Burnham's storied response was that Taft could hire, quote, even white rabbits, end quote, if they did the work. The newly assembled all-women team adopted the nickname the White Rabbits and worked out of Taft's studio in the Horticultural Building to produce monumental works like The Sleep of the Flowers and decorative sculptures that adorned many exhibition buildings. Several of the White Rabbits, including Janet Scudder, Julia Bracken, Carol Brooks, Enid Yandel, and Taft's sister Zulim, went on to lead the vanguard of American sculptors. The place that the White Rabbits worked out of, known as the Lorado Taft Midway Studios, were designated a National Historic Landmark in 1965 and listed in the National Register of Historic Places in '66. The Women's Building exhibits filling these rooms aim to celebrate women across a variety of design fields, including fine and applied arts, music, literature, science, philanthropy, and history. This was in part because the board was very intrigued by and excited about the shifting roles of women, especially in workplaces across the world. This is why, amongst the products produced or invented by women, you would see things like mechanical dusters or hand-rolled Spanish cigarettes. Still, though, not everyone loved the Women's Building at the time. Some women critiqued it by arguing that displaying women's achievements separately instead of alongside those of men suggested that they were secondary to men's achievements. They had a point. Our sources and I agree. There's a separate yet equal vibe going on here, as I would put it, and our sources say, quote, the Women's Building provided a socially sanctioned space in which the work of women was, first and foremost, codified as feminine before considered for merit, end quote. The methods and ideals of the Board of Lady Managers, the building, and the wider World's Fair Board were even then considered historic and somewhat outdated. There was a real adherence to designs that were traditionally feminine, especially so-called crafts like pottery and ceramics, paper flowers, stained glass, embroidery, and textiles. A lot of the art featured was watercolor paintings and murals. The public and the press of the 1890s definitely picked up on this too, as even those practices that are not traditionally women's, ones like woodworking, were described in the press at the time as delicate and floral in subject matter. The designation of all of these things as women's specifically kind of perpetuates the same stereotypes that maybe the Board of Lady Managers was hoping to break. Its legacy continues to be centered on these questions of the successes and the failures. Some of these successes were very important. The fair marked the first time that a pavilion had been devoted to women and the display of their work in World's Fair history. It created an unprecedented openness to female designers within the field after. The building even had an international influence. It inspired the Danish noblewoman Sophie Oxholm to organize a similar women's exhibition in Copenhagen a few years later. Plus, thousands of visitors attended to listen to female speakers at the board-sponsored World's Congress of Representative Women. Absolutely achievements worth celebrating, and I don't mean to take away from those. Yet there were some absolute failures, some growing points as well here. As we've covered, that board was very white and very privileged, and even as Time magazine says, their privileges allowed them to believe that they had won on equal competition their governance, their powers that they had. They didn't see the unfairness of their own representation when there was still this racial disparity going on in representation. Worse than this, the Board of Lady Managers, according to our sources, refused to exhibit Black women's accomplishments alongside their own. Instead, the women's building depicted Black, Native American, and Polynesian women in the Women's Work in Savagery exhibit, as it was called. Black activists like Ida B. Wells, Fannie Barrier Williams, and Frederick Douglass were super opposed to this. Wells argued that this exclusion of Black women from the women's building and this title of savagery suggested that Black people were not civilized, not achieved. Though there was some progress in the ways I mentioned, this progress was really slow going. Anti-suffrage groups would steal attention from the women's social movement in upcoming years after the Chicago Columbian, and a lot of women saw their responsibilities limited to hospitality and beautification functions in the 1930s fairs. And because we have a little extra time here, the unexpected bits of legacy from the Chicago 1893 World's Fair. The National Park Service tells us that organizers tasked Bertha Palmer with the concoction of a new portable dessert for the fair. Hello, sexist assumptions. She was not a baker. She turned instead to her husband's hotel's kitchens, and this resulted in the creation of the chocolate brownie. Architecture.org points out that the beef sausage, which became the foundation of the Chicago-style hot dog, also made its appearance at the 1893 exposition, as did Pabst beer. And sadly, that almost none of it lasted and so few buildings remain. Most of the exposition structures, including the women's building, burnt down or were demolished within a year. The survivors are the current Museum of Science Industry, which was the former Palace of Fine Arts, and, as we described above, the Art Institute of Chicago. When it comes to World Fair legacies in general, the New York Times notes that it's been a problem for them. They write that it's hard to assess really the costs and benefits of this format, the World's Fair, because money is so often spent on civic improvements which are not part of the fair but occur coincidentally, which benefit it. Fairs provide a good reason, an excuse to upgrade transportation, power, communication systems, to build parks, museums, and other cultural facilities. The problem is many of these facilities, structures, are short-term, not made to become permanent infrastructure. And this is not only a missed opportunity, it's a source of financial loss. More broadly, our sources seem to agree that there's too many other sources now for the sort of fantasy experience that a World Fair once held. Our sources also point out that generally there are other things that provide the fantasies that a World Fair once did for Americans. So even though their international presence remains strong, nowadays things like the Olympics, theme parks, especially Epcot, internet and movies will do it for an American. Some hopefuls still believe the World's Fair format could make a comeback in the U.S. in new, more tech-friendly terms, noting that World's Fairs loom large in the public imagination still. Seeing as in 2017, the U.S. made a serious bid to host Expo 2023 in Minnesota under the theme of Healthy People, Healthy Planet, that seems possible. Ultimately, they lost out to Argentina, but the U.S. has renewed its 2027 bid already, so who knows? We might see the World Fair come back to our section of the world. And that, honeys, concludes our story of the 1893 Chicago Exposition and the women's building and the board of lady managers within it. Hope you've enjoyed. Hope you've picked up a couple new things to look into and or factoids for Christmas conversations, whatever, you need to get you through the holiday work parties. I will be taking something of a vacation. You're only going to get your next business and then a holiday special, and that's it from me for the year. So enjoy, hydrate or dihydrate. Please, 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 please be careful on the roads. Please make smart decisions. Stay safe, take care, stay warm, and we'll talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.